Live from the Washington, D.C. area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. Water is life. By 2050, an estimated 6 billion, not million, 6 billion people are likely to face water scarcity due to climate change, pollution, and unsustainable consumption. Whether oceans, rivers, lakes, streams, our water bodies have been polluted scaringly wide and fast. Clean, sustainable water, our topic tonight. Welcome to Smart Sustainability. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. We face water scarcity, contamination, and an ever-increasing need of water to keep up with the production of the consumer goods we're consuming day to day. In many places where you once had wells that needed to go down in the ground only 120 feet to get to the water 10 years ago, today we need to drill down 200 feet and more. Droughts are part of the picture. As of April 2023, 28.23% of the contiguous United States, that means including Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, have experienced moderate to exceptional drought. Water bodies have been contaminated for decades, and one of the most pervasive drinking water contaminants is PFAS. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, a tongue breaker, that don't naturally break down. They're so-called forever chemicals and accumulate in water, soil, and also in the human body.
What do pizza boxes, your outdoor gear, skis, carpets, and photo paper have in common? Probably this four-letter word, PFAS.
An estimated 200 million Americans are drinking water contaminated with PFAS. It's been found in meats, in milk, in seafood, bottled water, fish and game.
About 70 years ago, humans invented a whole class of chemicals that improved things like this, and this, and this. But it turns out they're probably bad for us, and they can last forever. Forever chemicals are usually per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, which are thousands of chemicals known for being water, heat, oil, and corrosion resistant.
Studies found PFAS in the bloodstream of 99% of Americans that were tested. PFAS affect the endocrine system. They interfere with hormones, change body and brain. Water contamination is a huge issue today. Just think of the Potomac, the Chesapeake Bay, or any other water body nearby. We can't eat fish from the rivers, our dogs can't go swimming there, and we humans are more often than not advised to not get near anywhere of those contaminated waters. It's a bleak picture. Access to clean waters is not a given necessarily. According to the World Economic Forum, over 44% of the world's population are affected by water scarcity conditions. And if you think access to clean water is just an issue for developing countries, but not for us here in the United States, I urge you to reconsider. We have it right here on our doorstep. While we often believe in the United States, if you need drinking water, you just turn on the faucet, and that's the way we're used to using it, figures suggest that already 2.2 million people in the United States today are without running water and basic indoor plumbing, according to the United Nations. More than 44 million have inadequate water systems. Groundwater exhaustion, infrastructure challenges, climate change all play a role. Add pesticides and chemicals that end up in groundwater and our water bodies throughout the country, and you have a dangerous and utterly unhealthy mix for us and nature. More than 80,000 chemicals are registered in the United States for daily use. The average woman uses between 5 to 12 different products for skin and hair every single day. Chemical cocktails that end up going down the drain right into the groundwater. Although organic skincare products are projected to grow by about 8.9% annually for the next 10 years, according to Grand View Research, and organic household cleaners are supposed to grow by 11.1%, it's still a long shot, and a lot of chemicals that land in the water. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides for our yards and mass production agriculture are further adding explosives to the mix. Now, while municipalities take different approaches to help with water quality and water access, they're not required to take out all the chemicals, just the basics. And with data being touted as the new holy grail, we got to keep in mind that data uses a humongous amount of water for electricity. Just in Fairfax County alone, we have 27 data centers. They can use 500,000 gallons of water per day. So what does that leave us with? Who's responsible? Who can do something about it? And what's the corporate role and also your role in preserving our waters and help making them clean? I discuss this tonight with someone who not only talks the talk, but has walked the walk.
I saw some really horrible things that were happening to fish and wildlife and people. And I said, you know, we can do better by the planet. So I decided that I wanted to combine my love of cleaning as your love of cleaning, and I combine my love of the environment.
Priscilla Johnson, water resources engineer, an entrepreneur of Cocoa Shoal, formerly Echo Daisy, and educator. She believes that providing connectivity to billions without depleting natural resources may be a defining moment in history, where big tech, Facebook, Apple, and Google don't compete for water. She led one of the most aggressive sustainability initiatives for Microsoft Cloud to reduce data center water. An expert evaluator for commercial, agricultural, and industrial energy efficiency, Dr. Johnson worked at the largest private utility in California, is LEED accredited and a certified data center energy practitioner. Among other complex issues, she addressed the Dow Chemical Saginaw Bay watershed dioxin contamination cleanup, which spanned 22 counties in Michigan.
And there she is. Thanks so much for joining us, Priscilla. Great to have you on.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So clean water, Priscilla, I know this is very dear to your heart. Tell us, why did you get into clean water? Was this sort of an intuition? Was this an inner feeling? Or was this, did this come up one day and say, wow, here I am, I need to do something? Or did this evolve?
Well, it did a bit of both. I sort of knew since I was 13 that I wanted to be in the space in water. And I just would call it sort of an ancestral calling. And I really just heeded the call, and I went forward, ended up actually, interestingly, pursuing a degree in communications and film at NYU for undergraduate. But then in my last year, I heard the call again, and I was able to pivot back, finish my degree, but then go for my master's and PhD in environmental engineering. And I focused specifically on water. Very, very lucky to have been paired with the Water Resources Research Center and Dr. Jeff Wright at Purdue University. And there is when really my passion took off. And ever since then, I've been in 4 different industries, always working around water, always working around efficiency and education and communication around just how much we actually have the power to change what's going on right now.
I'm going to have to go back here for 1 second. You said you could just heed the call for water. So how do you know that this was the call for water? Is there a certain chemistry in your body that comes up and says, this is really something that makes me so drawn to that? What is it? What is it about water?
Well, water is one of those things where it's life itself. And I mean, if you just imagine what water does, it flows. It flows
Yes.
to the lowest points. It touches every surface. It changes and transforms things. And I think that just from a just ethereal standpoint, I think water for me is something that I'll always be immersed in one way or another. Even whatever industry I find myself in, including the current one I have, which is being CEO and founder of Cocoa Shoals. We manufacture eco-friendly cleaning products, and those products were initially designed for fish to make sure they would not harm fish and other wildlife. It was during my tenure at Dow Chemical that I saw just the extent of contamination of our industrial world and what we could do about it. And so I combined my love of cleaning and I combined my love of the environment and designed products for fish. So cocoa shoals, the products being mainly made out of coconut. And of course, shoals, a shoal is where fish gather. It was a natural culmination of those two things and my desire. So I've always been attracted to how you clean water, how you care for it, how you conserve it. And a lot of my family and friends, they're kind of nervous around me because they think, oh gosh, I can't let Priscilla see me, misusing water or leaving the water running when I'm brushing my teeth. And I mean, I have to say, it's nothing like that. I am very conservative when it comes to water. But the work that I've done has really been on an industrial scale. And I think those are some of the issues that you brought up in the beginning of the broadcast, is that the industrial scale seems so daunting, the pollution that's out there, and just our inability sometimes in some places to not even find water because of droughts. And sometimes there's just too much water because of floods and other events like hurricanes and cyclones.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you mentioned before you always wanted to be immersed in water. I find this very interesting because when you think of all the elements, water is actually the only elements where you can truly immerse in on a physical sense. We can go into the water, but we cannot go into the air. You cannot go into the fire. Well, you can, but it would be kind of stupid. But the thing is, like, the water is really something where we can immerse into. So there is, I think, a very different connection generally that we have with the water element. Now, when we talk about the chemicals, Priscilla, yes, there's a lot of contamination. And from your household goods, when you started out, when did you start out with your company, Cocoa Shoals?
2009 is when I started out. It was under another name, Eco Daisy, and we.
So when you look back at some of the statistics from 2009 about the water quality and how the pollution was then, and you compare it to now, what are some of the key insights that you're taking away from that? Do you feel in some way that we've progressed towards more awareness and improving the water quality, or have we actually industrially wise gone downhill?
So I would have to say that it has not been a good picture. It hasn't been a good story. And that's mainly because of just the volume of chemicals that are being produced, as well as the ability for our federal and state agencies to even keep up with what you can even and have to account for in terms of testing different analytes and reporting those and making sure that they're under certain limits before you either release that water back into the environment or reclaim that water for drinking water purposes, for example, in certain areas. And I think that is the biggest challenge, is now it's just the volume, the complexity of byproducts, because there are already chemicals existing. You had mentioned forever chemicals, and yes, they are there. These persistent organic pollutants are out in the environment, and they do tend to have a lasting effect where for decades, we can find them ending up still in the fish and the wildlife and now in the people.
Yeah, it always amazes me why, at some point we're going to have to talk about this, even though no one really wants to talk about the state of the industry. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, why do we actually have so many chemicals and have more and more registered every day versus actually taking a different approach and start looking at, wait a minute, so how can we limit the chemicals and actually focus on industries that are healthy for the environment and healthy for the water and healthy for what we need versus the other way around? What's your take on that?
So for me, it's complex, but it's actually very simple. It's complex because of the things that I just spoke about in terms of just what's out there and existing in the environment.
Yeah.
But we have this phenomenon in business where you stop things, and you stop things because you've reassessed a situation. You said it's not good. This isn't great for the bottom line, or it's either maybe a product that isn't desired anymore. So you stop manufacturing it. And what that really says is that consumers actually have the upper hand, but they don't realize it. When they can demand healthier products, when they can demand products free of, for example, PFAS, which is what you mentioned in the beginning of the broadcast, or other chemicals. And if you just look at, for example, the cosmetics industry, there are a number of products that are paraben-free, sulfate-free, and there's a reason for that. It's because consumers became educated, and then they started demanding different products be produced.
They did, and it took a long time actually to get to this point, because parabens were the cheapest to put in there, the cheapest preservatives, and this is why it was used for so long. And until there were actually studies that showed that women would have parabens in some of their ovarian cancers and in other places in the body, actually nobody stopped producing those. They would still put them back in. I mean, this is just really completely incredible when we think about this, that we have been so lame, and there's no other word, and so lame in terms of our change capability in the industry to get out of things when we know they're not good, and then just switch to something else, which I find really, really, really so pressing and so depressing at times. Now, when we look at the state of water in the United States, Priscilla, can you give us a brief overview in terms of what are some of the key areas that are really code red, or some of the areas where we say maybe we have a chance of cleaning it up to some extent, and where are some areas where we've really that we still need to protect because they might be in a better state? What are some of these areas? Can you give us some?
Sure. So I'll just start in general and say that, we have a fantastic, we're really blessed here in the United States, have fantastic critical infrastructure system for both water treatment and wastewater treatment. This is, why and how we have a healthier society. This is a symbol of an advanced society, that you do have that, where you don't have open sewers. You can harken back to London, where people were throwing the waste into the Thames River. We don't have that anymore to the degree that we had it back in the early industrialized era. Mm-hmm. But what we do have now are various water authorities. For example, right here in Fairfax County, the Fairfax County Water Authority is composed of over 44 water authorities. And what they do is they make sure that the water that gets to you, the drinking water that gets to you in your tap, is drinkable, mm-hmm. and that it doesn't cause undue harm. And what does that mean? That means that the EPA and other state agencies, and sometimes even the local agencies, decide on what they're going to test for in the water. And they make sure that before it gets returned back to you, that it's within certain limits. And we've seen where this has failed. I think Flint is probably the biggest and most recent example of that, where it's failed, I believe also down in Jackson, Mississippi as well. So there are areas where there are cause for concern, where there is potentially no oversight, or very little oversight, and very little enforcement. And I would say that those are anomalies. So in the grand scheme of things, we have very dedicated public officials that are working on our behalf every single day and every single night, because these laboratories work around the clock, making sure they collect samples, and anything that goes back into the environment, as I said, we make sure that they're not above certain levels. Mm-hmm. So that's first. So in general, we have a system in place. The question becomes, what do we do when we have, for example, excess runoff? Right here in Fairfax County, if you look at the water district, you can see that there are about 6 impaired water tributaries. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? That means they're typically impaired by excess nitrogen and excess phosphorus. Where does that come from? That comes from typically agricultural runoff in the form of excess nutrients from fertilizers. And in our industrialized society, we find these pretty much all over the United States, where these quote unquote impaired tributaries, these paired waterways, are afflicted most definitely by nitrogen and phosphorus. So what do we do about it? So the question becomes is, do we change our agricultural standards when we have more and more people to feed, and fertilizer is typically used and pesticides in order to grow and yield more food? So the question becomes, how do we change this? How does a person get informed? And now more than ever, you can be informed about what's going on in your backyard. As a matter of fact, in terms of water quality, there's a website that you can go to that I'm sure you'll apprise your viewers on, right here in Fairfax County, where you can find out about the water quality. And it is actually something that nationwide is required every year, annually. You can find out what the water quality is in your area from your water authority. So you could be empowered with a lot of information where you could start with the basics. And by the way, it's free. So you can start with the basics, inform yourself, find out what's going. If you have a question, for example, well, what's this chemical? You can go to a website called ewg.org. It's the Environmental Working Group. They keep track of a lot of chemicals that are in consumer goods and products, particularly in cosmetics. But you could also just type in a chemical and find out, well, how hazardous is this to my health? I think rates it on sort of a radar color scale of going from yellow to red.
I noticed, Priscilla, though, there are still differences between what, for example, European agencies allow versus what the United States allows. So I know that in Europe, for example, there are still stricter standards, actually, when it comes to water, when it comes to also ingredients in general, whether in skincare and in household goods, than in the United States.
Without a doubt, Europe has always been 10 to 15 years ahead of the United States when it comes to environmental standards. So typically the flow of regulation goes what the European Union does. First, it was individual European nations, and then when the EU was formed, those regulations, in particular environmental ones that govern water, since we're talking about that today, they cascade it down to the state of California. California typically adopted a lot of what Europe and then now the European Union has for standards. And, you know, here in the United States, people think that California is a heavily regulated state for business and environment. And the fact of the matter is, compared to the rest of the country, you could say that, but they're taking a step that where Europe is already. The best example of that is the dyes that are in food. What's permitted in Europe is not permitted here. The red dyes, for example, the blue dyes, you can't put that in food there. And so I think people have to question, well, why? Why isn't it something that's regulated here in the United States? And again, it's a very simple thing. I will never forget one of the representatives that I spoke with, congressional representatives I spoke with years ago, said, you know what? If I don't have a letter or an email from a constituent voicing a concern about something, then how will I know? I can't represent them. Let them know. As much as there perhaps is, you know, dysfunction in Washington, there are people that are very dedicated to actually following up on these issues.
And I think that brings something up that we really need to take back to the people, so in this case our viewers, you at home, because I do think there is a responsibility on the consumer side also to really stay on track and stay involved and educate yourself and make your voice heard, and actually also go through the effort and stand up for the type of water quality that you would like to have, which also, I think, Priscilla, that also we need to start also putting a little bit more pressure in terms of what we're using in the agriculture for fertilizers and so on, because that does impact the groundwater, and there are more and more alternatives out there. In fact, we had a show on that, what can be done in terms of alternative and more natural fertilizers that would still actually produce the same amount of food and healthier food, higher nutrition, healthier for the soil versus letting it totally erode and sort of disappear, so to speak. We're going to go into a quick break. When we come back, I do want to talk more about the actual pollutions that we have in the water, so more about the chemicals. And here we're back. Thanks so much for watching. Tonight we're going to talk about clean water and how important it really is for us and what we can all do about it. You at home, corporations, and also, of course, on the municipality side. With me tonight is Dr. Priscilla Johnson, whose love for water actually I think becomes pretty evident. So I want to keep right talking about this. I want to shift gears here a little bit, Priscilla, and talk a little bit about some of the prime chemicals that we find. We talked a little bit about some things that come from the agricultural world. We talked about the PFAS. We talked, what are other things that are really contributing so much to making our waters literally sick?
Well, it depends upon where you live. So I think pretty much anyone can say that, they live in some sort of industrialized environment, even though it seems like it's pristine. I'll give you a good example. Places in northern Idaho, you imagine, that's this beautiful kind of like, expansive, land.
Yeah.
If you really look back into the history, there's mining there. There was mining operations. And what do they typically use in mining operations? They use heavy metals. And so with that, heavy metals are heavily regulated actually in terms of drinking water and making sure they're tested for and they're below certain levels. So when you look at where you live, the question becomes, well, do I have, a history of industrialized pollution in my area? And if you do, those chemicals are typically will find themselves there. So we talked about agriculture. We talked about the two top ones, nitrogen and phosphorus coming from fertilizers. And then there are other things from pesticides that are more pernicious and cancer causing. Mm-hmm. And then there's, of course, as I'd spoken about, there's mining as well. And there are some areas where you don't have enough water. And that has become a really strong concern in the Southwest at this point in time. And you probably have heard about the mega drought, the onset of it being some 2 to 3 years ago. And now we're, living in the first years of it where we have the Colorado River that is threatened. So water quantity in certain areas is really the problem and not necessarily water quality. You can live also in other areas where there are less pernicious things like, like scale, like you can, be living like in the Midwest, in large part, it's on a limestone aquifer. And what do you get from limestone aquifers? You get, your calcium buildup, your magnesium buildup, and scaling issues. And that causes, not just residents heartache, but usually you can get a water softener and you're fine with it. But then there's on the industrial level, you also have to deal with hard water as well. So there's a water quality issue. So it depends upon really where you live in the country, what you're dealing with. And now some of these sites too, depending upon where you live, they may be on what's called the National Priorities List. That's a list that sort of precedes being on what's called the Superfund site list. And, a lot of folks have heard of Superfund, and it's essentially a designation where the contamination is so vast and great in combination with the fact that the industries that cause the contamination are no longer operating. And so the federal government has to step in, and they do have literally a fund, which is called Superfund, that's used for monitoring and used for mitigating or remediating, trying to remove some of those contaminants over time.
When we talk about overtime, Priscilla, give us a window for the overtime. Because that seems to me can be a really large window. And it seems to me we really are out of time for that.
That's a really good question. So the time factor is sometimes decades. I mean, now we're, there's certain, chemical companies that started back in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
And they've been sitting in the same place since the late 1800s and sitting on waterways since the late 1800s. And again, it preceded the Environmental Protection Agency. So the EPA's laws regulations and enforcement was not there prior to the chemical manufacturing. And so those are places that are typically hotspots in the United States that have been cause for concern for regulators and for the companies themselves. They've had to step up and do advanced mitigation and monitoring. But again, it comes back to people being informed. You can't always rely on people to give the full information and full account of what's going on in your watershed. And your watershed essentially is a big catchment area for water that flows in from miles around. Sometimes it's hundreds of miles around. And that catchment area is where your viewers, actually get their sources of water. Sometimes it's surface water, like in Fairfax County, and sometimes it's groundwater that you've alluded to. The groundwater issue is becoming more and more of concern, because now that we have more and more of these chemicals that are in the environment, they seep into our groundwater, where people use wells to collect their water and use their water for drinking. And a lot of times those wells, sometimes they're not tested all the time. And so it's on, it's on the individual person to have their well tested, to make sure not just that it's pumping water at a certain gallon per minute, but that it has, you're under the limit for chemicals that can harm you. So, I keep coming back to this theme of citizen empowerment. I mentioned to you before, the water quality reports that you can get on an annual basis. You can get the information from the Environmental Working Group, ewg.org, as to what that chemical is and what harm it might cause. And then there's also writing your representatives. There's nothing more, in my opinion, bipartisan than clean water.
Oh, I totally agree. I totally agree. But I also think, Priscilla, I want to talk a little bit more about that citizen empowerment. Because if we need agencies all the time to regulate companies in terms of what they put into the water, we have a real problem in society, and we have a problem that is simply a wrong business model. And I think this is the time when we really need to address that at that point. Because we keep hearing all these things. We need regulation, we need regulatory agencies here and regulatory agencies there, but it brings up the question, why do we actually need this in the first place, when as a person, as a normal person with a rational mind, who would put poison in the water and then, knowing that this is drinking water you're going to feed your grandchildren or anyone else? So that is the disconnect that I think we really need to address. And it doesn't help anyone to say we need more regulatory here or regulatory here. I think this comes really straight down to citizen responsibility and also business responsibility.
And that's where it lies. And so when you talk or hear about, environmental sustainability or ESG, the environmental social governance move that a lot of the corporations are touting as how they are going to address what's quote unquote called sustainability. And it's been, they can change the name, but at the end of the day, the narrative has to be written by people.
I
it
totally
cannot
agree.
be written by businesses.
Yes.
And I've worked in Fortune 500 companies. Some people were very, very serious about sustainability and getting behind their company's sustainability goals. And then I found on some occasions where marketing was really what they wanted to do, instead of actually working within their own four walls of trying to reduce their energy usage, to reduce their water usage. It was always sort of painted as if they were doing something. And so I think that's what people are talking about, what greenwashing is. And greenwashing is just that. It basically
deploys marketing. It does.
Right. And so what it is people having to be more aware that they can't be manipulated by what a commercial says or what a spokesperson says.
Yeah.
And I think this critical thinking this critical thinking of, wait a minute, let me sit back here. All of these businesses are created for me, the consumer. I consume these products. Why don't I have more of a say of what these products contain? And that is the power, really,
Consumers have.
of consumers, and however they choose to use it, whether they're writing their representative or they're posting on TikTok or Instagram.
Or avoid the product if they know they still keep doing that, which is really the language that every business understands. If you cut the funding, they get the message usually.
100%.
Yeah. I totally agree. But Priscilla, I think that also brings up one other thing, and we need to talk about this because I would like to invite our viewers and our audience also to look into this. I've noticed that sometimes when we deal with a lot of chemicals, for example, it can be daunting to find out exactly what do they stand for, what do they do, what are they used for, and come up with your own thinking about this. You mentioned critical thinking, which is really important. So I think sometimes it can be quite challenging for people to just familiarize themselves or get more acquainted, more educated on certain ingredients or certain chemicals and what they do. How can we take out the fear from people to actually look into this? Now, I know when you look at your environmental engineering, your degrees also, you know exactly what I mean. Now, you're familiar with most of the chemicals because you studied them. So for someone who hasn't had this exposure to biology, to chemistry, it can be really quite overwhelming. What would you advise someone to take out the fear of that, and literally just as a starting point, how do you get into that?
So, there's two things. I'd mentioned one before, which is the Environmental Working Group's website. So that's a place where a chemical that you're wondering what is this? I want to go and just type this in. It's 18 letters long. Go into their website, type it in, and I think on some occasions you can even see the structure of the chemical itself or compound. That kind of takes the fear out of it, is knowing that the information is at your fingertips. You can just pick up your phone, go to their website, type it in. But then there's another more, I think, basic way of approaching things. If you think about what we started with before there were chemicals. I mean, what did people use? What did Cleopatra use for her makeup? She used berries.
A lot of natural ingredients.
Yes, I was just on a trip in Guatemala, and I saw these women that were. It's a co-op that makes textiles, and they make beautiful like tablecloths and quilts and pillowcases and when I was there, they gave a little lesson on what they used to dye their fabric. And it literally was like bugs. These bugs were this beautiful, brilliant blue. And I looked at that and I said, that's so simple. And so if we ever ask ourselves about what we're putting into our bodies, what we're putting on our face, on our lips, how simple is it? Can you break it down? Is it just an oil, or is it something that you'd have to go to that website to type in? And not to say, by the way, that all chemicals are bad, the ones that you would have to type into the website. But what I'm trying to say is that if people want to take the fear out of what they're using and putting into their bodies, they just go back to the basic things. Is it a potato that's, potato chip that's just made out of a potato, or is there something else in there? It's just really going down to the basics. Totally. And I think that's kind of how I live my life. It's very elemental like that.
Yeah. Now let's shift gears here, because I think consumption is a really important factor, Priscilla. You mentioned the dye. I know the fashion industry actually is a huge polluter of water, and it takes a lot of water to actually produce fashion. In fact, we had an episode on that, and I want to show you a clip about how much water it takes to make a piece of clothing. Watch. No one at this point, I think, would describe sustainable fashion as cool, sexy, and fun quite yet. Yet the latter really is the underlying attraction to fashion. The fashion industry is one of the big impactors on the environment. From the materials that are being used to how they're sourced, made, produced, to how they're shipped, traded, and at the end of the cycle, wasted. The fashion industry is worth about $1.5 trillion globally and employs more than 300 million people along the value chain. It produces an estimated 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. The production of crops, fibers, and garments pollute water, air, and soil. The textile industry is actually the second largest polluter of local freshwater in the world, mounting up to about 1/5 of all water pollution. Manufacturing clothing takes up a lot of water as well. To produce one cotton shirt, just as an example, the fashion industry uses 2,700 liters of water. That's equivalent of 2.5 years of drinking water. Add on the synthetic fibers and the mountains of overproduced clothes every day. 87% of total fiber input in the United States is either landfilled or incinerated. Less than 1% of the material used to produce clothing is recycled into new clothing. So when you actually look at this, Priscilla, when you look at the fashion we wear every day, when we look at how much water it takes to make a piece of clothing, which is really, most people have no idea, and we need to get to a point where I think we as consumers become a lot more aware, as if you wear something that's printed, if you wear something that's dyed, then you know how much water was being used to actually do it and how much of the dye goes back into the water again of all the rest. I think all of these things are huge issues. I want to talk for a little bit more about the consumption side, what we can do as consumers to become aware of some of the main industries that really consume lots of water in production. So I mentioned fashion a little bit. I know that's a huge issue. I wanted to switch also, we live in the computer age, Priscilla. Data centers. Here in Fairfax County, we have lots of data. In fact, 27% of the world's data that basically runs through our area here. We have 27 data centers. Talk to us about the use of water and data centers. Because I think that's, for most of us, that's also something that's not even being considered.
Yes, so I'll start with this. Whenever you have your phone on or you're on your computer and you're accessing a website, you are accessing data that's served from a physical location. And that physical location is a building, and that building has hundreds, sometimes millions of servers in it. And what does a server do? Well, a server essentially just serves you back the zeros and ones in the form of graphics, in the form of text and sound, and it's all over the world.
Yeah.
And so what do these physical buildings require? Well, with these servers in them, the servers actually typically run pretty hot. A server can typically run up to in excess of 100 degrees without failure. Yes. And so they're very hot. It's very hot for people to actually work in a data center. So they need to be cooled. And so they're cooled by, depending upon where you are, it could be evaporative cooling, which is literally just using water to cool air that gets pushed through that data center with fans. So that's energy that's being used. In order to have the energy generated, you need water, depending upon where the energy comes from. Mm-hmm. And so you have a whole cycle that's working in the background that is consuming energy, that's consuming water, but it's serving you that picture or that video.
Yeah.
And it's something that people typically don't think about. So from time to time, I usually turn my phone off. And I think the best time to do it is just to turn your phone off at night. And what does that do?
Which is healthy for you anyway, actually.
Much healthier for you.
Yeah.
And, it just has such a calming effect too. I mean, if you've ever noticed what it's like when you turn your phone off,
Yeah. Yeah.
where you don't have, electronics operating.
Yeah.
So what does it do? I mean, it actually, it requests less data from a data center that may be in an area that's water stressed. And so why are all these data centers all over the place? Why are they concentrated, for example, in the Washington, D.C. or Northern Virginia area? Well, historically, many, many decades ago, that's where the data were actually the internet and the World Wide Web actually were being developed by DARPA, which later became ARPA. And we have built an infrastructure of these buildings all over the world. And it's very impressive. When you go into a data center, they could be, 1 million, 2 million square feet, and you hear the hum of the data center, of the servers. And, there's not a lot of people working in them, but it's just very impressive, when you go by them.
Yeah. But Priscilla, I have a question for you though. So when we have, on the one hand, this push for a more sustainable approach to how we live, work, and do business, on the other hand, there's this huge push for more data, for more artificial intelligence, for more electronics. And actually, interestingly enough, usually both ideas get peddled by the same type of people, but they're actually kind of in collision course. So how do we reconcile the need for, and I don't even think we do have a need for more data, quite frankly, because I think we're not even using the data we have correctly or sufficiently enough. So, but how do we recognize this more push for more technology and more electronics and more data with the same time while pushing the need, and that is a need, for being gentler and more in tune with nature and the environment?
I think that, interestingly, I think the companies, the largest companies that run these data centers would probably agree with you. They don't need the capacity that they've built.
Yeah.
And why do I say that? I say that because there's different motivations for building in the capacity that they built them in. There's a lot of competition, but at the same time, there's a smarter way to do things, because as we've seen, for example, on the island of Ireland, there's a moratorium on data centers, on building them, because there's no more energy. They are tapped out of the energy that's required to even operate the data centers. So that should tell you something right there.
Yep.
Singapore, same thing. It had a moratorium on data centers as well because of the water that it was taking. And Singapore, if anyone's been there, it is a very water-stressed island nation.
Yes.
And so with that, the question becomes, and I think it's a very good question, do we need all these data? And what are we doing with the billions upon billions? It's not even billions now. I think we're into the zetta and petabytes. And
that's right.
We are now at a point where I think where it's just like, fast fashion. Yeah. You're consuming something because you can. And I remember when I was coming along, I was in grad school and learning about the ethics of engineering. And there was a very interesting question that one of the lecturers had. And they said, if you're an engineer, would you build something just because you could? Or do you build it because it's needed?
Exactly.
And that is an essential question, because now we are at a tipping point where there are fewer resources. The scarcity of resources, natural resources, is what we're talking about water today, but just in general.
Yeah.
So I am really interested in pivoting towards, at least in the digital space, and pivoting towards the intelligent use of what we have now.
Oh, totally.
And I guarantee you there will be and can be and already are business models that are built around what we have now, not in the linear fashion of consumption that we have accustomed ourselves to and accepted.
Yeah.
Again, it goes back to that start-stop model that I'd spoken about before in business. Just when you start something, you can stop it at the same time.
Exactly.
You pivot on it. And then here's a word that your viewers may have heard before: you reuse. You reuse something. You repair something.
Recycle,
And
reuse, repair,
yes,
the 3 R's.
it comes back
And
to this.
remaking it, remade.
It comes back to these very simple principles.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you want to tell a marketing story about sustainability and ESG and what you're doing for the environment, tell that story, how we pivoted and stopped using so many of our natural resources. Now, I can guarantee you that's A, bipartisan, and B, something that
Yeah.
consumers love to hear.
Now, Priscilla, we have only 2 minutes left, so I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned now pivoting. Let's talk very, very briefly, touch on how we pivot, because pivoting requires risk taking. And a lot of companies have actually gotten to a point where they have become very risk averse. Although at this point, I don't really think anyone has the luxury anymore of being like this. I think we have to get much more in the pioneering stage of actually going out and simply pivot and do stuff. And even without knowing where we're going to come out, but we do know that we need to do something. So very briefly, give us just like a very, very brief last few sort of bullet points in how do companies pivot?
I'll just give you an analogy of a bookend. Bookends. And the bookends refer to our population. The people that have the most experience and the most wisdom, you better include them in this conversation because they've seen things, they've seen technology changes and advances. And more importantly, they've seen how society has either adapted or recoiled from such advances. And it could go all the way back to the atom bomb. On the other bookend are our youth. And these are folks that have the most to lose with the decisions that we make, the folks that have the power and the resources now. Put those two together. Put the bookends together. And there, right in the middle, you're going to find your solutions. So what does that mean? That means the startups, the entrepreneurs looking for these new, fresh ideas and ways of seeing things. It's not scary.
Yeah.
It's our future.
I love it. And on that note, Priscilla, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. The co-creation part, I love as an ending, which is also a powerful beginning, I think, for a new story to unfold. That's why I want to keep talking more about it. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for watching, and you have a wonderful week. And stay tuned to how we actually continue to co-create our future going forward. Have a good night. Thank you, my dear.
My pleasure. That was a lot of fun.
That was a lot of fun. It was also really good. We covered a lot of ground.
I was really surprised. That was really your ability and the way you ask questions and set them up.